And there we go. So we're just getting started. And welcome back, everybody, after a week and a day, an extra week and a day's hiatus. So it's been 15 days since we last gathered, and wanted to just go through where we are currently at in terms of we talked about history. We talked what we believe, mostly centered around the crest. I mean, I think that was a topic that this is one worth coming back to. And Gary, from your questions, that's very much the case. That I use the crest kind of as uh, the 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 focal point around it. But there were a couple things we just didn't get into because we're still very much keep in mind the orbital view back here. And then this week is the phrase is how do we live in community? But it's really more about governance. How do we make decisions as the United Church of Canada? Um, and then next week. Now this is only my broad guideline. If you have any questions or would like to do, I'm plenty happy to keep adding more. We could do a week 5 that is a general discussion that I wouldn't necessarily have any slides, and we can have a conversation that way. Uh, that'll be a conversation we can have next week. But also talking about different things in terms of where where we're going. For example, the conversations of different cooperations, how things, a chance to kind of talk about different things, because like there's the realities that we're facing as a United Church, that we are currently, and collectively as a church, we're currently in a low point between what uh the uh, the potential for a new great awakening is there. But at the same time, there's always like through history, there's always these ebbs and flows, and within our own experiences, we would be kind it would be fair to say that we're in a bit of an ebb, but there are signs and potential of where God is calling us next, and that's where we're going to be moving with that for next week. So, again, this is some of the boilerplate recap. Again, the material that we're dealing with tonight is the stuff that this particular book that Ralph Milton has put out, that is uh, this is actually officially out of date. Um, because almost as soon as the newest edition of this book, of which I understand they're actually Ralph Milton is formally retired. Uh, I mean, he's 89 years old, and so I don't think we're going to see another edition of this book, at least that he would take on. But it was published in 2017, and as we'll talk about tonight, uh, the United Church of Canada changed its governance model significantly in 2018, and so but we'll talk about that. So again, this is just these are my recap slides, just as a reminder that here's the interesting thing, that currently, at least as of 2021, there were 388,363 formally baptized members of the United Church of Canada, roughly just over 1% of Canada's population. And yet, in the 2021 census, approximately 1.2 million people still associate or identify themselves with the United Church of Canada, which is almost 3 times as much as what we sort of see collectively across Canada in terms of a regular worship within our communities. It's also a reminder, like particularly here in Nanaimo. Nanaimo is and this is actually something that Tiff brought up in her sermon on the 5th, that we happen to live in the most secular municipality in all of Canada, and or the most secular or the least religious community in all of Canada, and that it's well above the national average in terms of regular church attendance. However, this is part of the conversation for next week in terms of where the potential lies. That there is still a lot of people that associate themselves. Here's one that I'm going to throw out. Apparently, there was a bequest made to the United Church of Canada just within the past month that arrived on the doorstep. It came from someone who was not part of the United Church of Canada, but liked who we are, liked what we stand for, and therefore bequested $9 million to the United Church of Canada at the national level. That just came in apparently in the past month, so just there's something that's kind of interesting. So I'm going to just skip past that little slide. And of course, talking about the cooperation between the different denominations in terms of coming together, and what we talk about in terms of what we believe, and how really three different groups came together that actually had at least two major streams of belief, how they came together. And so, in terms of, we looked at the crest the last time we did, in terms of the different symbols in the crest, and I hope that was a bit more of gave you a better understanding of the crest itself. I mean, it's just absolutely rife with symbolism, and it's been revised a couple of times, most recently, to add the colors of the medicine wheel, and the saying in Mohawk, of all my relations, as a parallel to the Latin, that all may be one. But then the question is, as the United Church, how do we live in community? And in other words, how do we actually organize ourselves? How do we govern ourselves? How do we be the church together? And part of it is, we look at what the first real part is, how do we get to this point? How did we, you didn't just, the way in which we are together as a community organization, we just simply didn't pull out of the air. There's a fair history of development around this, and of course, the United Church of Canada, we were formed by bringing in three different methods of governance together. And how did that come together? What did that look like? And what are those different parts? And what can we still see in our current system based on what we have there? And the basis of union, those 29 articles, set out a means of governance that included elements of Methodist, Presbyterian, and Congregationalist characteristics in all of them. Indeed, one would think, given the types of governance, that I'm going to actually detail those in a little bit, of how they came together. How could they come together? That's something that everybody could agree on, and they did. And then, of course, how has it changed since then? And of course, the most significant change has actually happened within the past 5 years, and so it happened, in fact, just before I came here. And we're still trying to figure out how that one works, but we're going to talk about that tonight. But the question is, how do we get there? So I want to go much more broader, because at least two of you here tonight, this is going to speak more to your frame of reference and in terms of how we got here, in understanding the differences between, say, how Anglicans govern themselves, how Roman Catholics govern themselves, and how we govern ourselves, and going to try and cover that because it's actually rooted in a certain degree of history. And so each of us, depending upon what our backgrounds are, like if you were raised Baptist, you have a language of governance and understanding around how that works. If you were raised Anglican, it's going to be different. It's one of these things where one of the worst words within a church setting is the word traditional, and not because tradition is bad. Tradition is actually good. The difficulty is that I love nuances. I love words that can mean multiple different things. The word tradition is the reverse of nuance, is that it means many different things, but everybody thinks it means what they think it means. So in other words, when you say traditional worship, well, does it mean traditional Baptist? Does it mean traditional Roman Catholic? Does it mean traditional Anglican? Does it mean traditional Presbyterian? Does it mean traditionally Ukrainian Orthodox, for example? Potentially, all of those are represented within Trinity's community now, in terms of that background, because everybody has such a different background of what that is. So we're going to talk about different styles of church governance, and really there's approximately four broadly different styles that we talk about. One is called episcopal polity, and it is the effectively pretty much the oldest and most surviving. So it looks like we have Cheryl arriving. So I'm just going to pause as she comes in. There we go. Hi, Cheryl. So in terms of styles of church governance, I'm going to be using some languages. Polity simply means a means of governance, a means of governing. Hi, Cheryl.
Hi.
So, and of course, and sorry, I forgot to mention my usual disclaimer of saying there is no such thing as a stupid question, and there's never a bad time to ask it. So if you have a question, either stick up your hand or use the raise hand button as I'm talking, and hopefully I can cover this. So anyway, there's episcopal polity, there's connectional polity, there's what is called Presbyterian polity, and Congregationalist polity. These are fairly broad terms, and we're going to roughly cover all of them. And the first one I'm actually going to start with is the one system of governance that the United Church of Canada does not use, is an episcopal polity. But the reason that we're using it is because the governance system that we have, or the system that we have, can trace its roots back to episcopal polity, even though we don't use it. And because this is also the most widespread, it means a governance through a hierarchy of ordained priests, or more specifically, bishops, who have increasing authority over wider areas. That you have individuals who are effectively granted a certain degree of power and authority over increasingly larger areas. And part of that comes from what is called, and I don't have it necessarily written down here. It's called apostolic succession. In other words, at one point, it represents the passing of teaching authority from one person to another, and eventually this became formalized and ritualized. And the idea is that you have someone who is an overseer, namely, and the name that we have, at least in English, is called a bishop. Means from the Greek episkopos, meaning overseer, someone who looks after a larger area. Whereas priests, on the other hand, it comes from the name presbyteros, which will come up again later, meaning elder. And the idea is that a bishop is a priest who has regional authority over a group of priests in a given geographic area. And the bishops themselves, because they have been themselves commissioned and taught by somebody else, they carry on what's called apostolic succession to those whom they ordain, teach, and teach in order to carry on that work. That's in and that's this system, in terms of having a bishop carrying on that tradition of teaching, um, existed even before even before Christianity became legal within the Roman Empire. Um, and so the idea is that authority derives from being taught directly, and they would argue that you can actually trace a direct line from any given priest all the way back to the apostles, in terms of that pattern. Um, and that's where that sense of authority is granted. Um, but that was simply an organizational structure. In the early church, it was house churches, because of course you didn't have buildings. Churches were groups of people. The word church actually derives from the Greek ecclesia. And here's the interesting thing. We tend to talk about church as a generic thing for the gathering of a religious community or a physical building. Church to Christianity is the same as synagogue to Judaism, as mosque is to Islam. It is uniquely a Christian term, and any other group that uses it is effectively doing cultural appropriation. So the Church of Scientology, for example, is appropriating that term inappropriately, for example. And so because it means that it was specifically used to refer to a gathering of Christians, and from its earliest time. But of course, once Christianity became legal, they could also start building their own buildings, and they could then freely organize themselves in whatever way they want. But the easiest way to do it was to parallel the existing regional and administrative structures within the Roman Empire. And so these regional things were regional areas were referred to as dioceses. And I'm not sure, Richard, your camera's off, but this is where, and Beryl as well. This is where the concept of the diocese, or a region in which there are a number of smaller, um, like inside a diocese, there are smaller groups. And the symbol of the bishop's authority was often referred to as a chair or a seat, and from the word sedes, and then so you have the term see. And so you might hear the term a see, and it's pronounced like just as I see something, but it actually comes from the chair. So a diocese and a see mean exactly the same thing. Now, on the other hand, in the Roman Catholic Church, the Holy See is the reference to the diocese that is Rome. And we're going to get to that in a second. Other little bit of trivia. We often think of the word cathedral as being a big church, and that's not actually the case. A cathedral is where the seat of authority of the bishop sits. So you could actually have a tiny little church, and if that's where the bishop works out of, that's the cathedral. But most of the time, bishops usually have egos and need enormous buildings to house those egos in. If I can be so bold. And so you have these cathedrals, like for example Salisbury Cathedral. That's where, at least at one time, I don't know if this is still the case, but Salisbury Cathedral in Salisbury, um, in southern England, is this enormous structure. But the name cathedral means that's where the bishop was. That's where the bishop maintains their office. So that's where that comes from. And each individual diocese, the bishop largely is the one who had authority over their respective regions, including ordaining other priests, regulating what churches were open when, founding new churches. All of that belonged to the bishop. Now, sometimes the bishop would have councils, and these days, quite often they do, in terms of giving them advice on how to administer it. But ultimately, the authority lies with the bishop. But they would also gather in larger groups of other bishops, in councils or synods. They actually means the same thing, to make decisions concerning the wider church. And in the early church, we talked about this when I did the history in the first week, about those councils or those synods. So they would get together every once in a while and make decisions relevant to the larger church. But for the most part, they were fairly independent of each other. But the thing is, over time, and as large as it was, you also then had to have almost additional layers of authority, and certain dioceses within larger regions that could help support some of the smaller ones were then divided further into what became known as larger regional bodies called archdioceses, and then you get archbishops. In other words, they have an overarching authority over other bishops, and of course, and then there's a whole additional ranking system that emerged out of this, which I do not have time to get into, because there are different kinds of bishops. Things like suffragan bishops and metropolitan bishops, and all these kinds of things that each have their own kind of subtle thing. But I'm not here to talk about Roman Catholic polity. I'm here to talk about United Church polity, and so I want to try and move through this. Now, remember how I said that in early Christianity there were 5 centers. There was Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, in terms of the centers of Christianity. Each one of those, the bishop in those locations were referred to as they were acknowledged as the titular heads of those particular, effectively what were provinces. And the Bishop of Rome was always, because Rome was the Latin speaking one and everybody else spoke Greek. In some respects, I hate to say this, but it was almost like they had an inferiority complex that they had to overcompensate, of saying, well, we're the first among equals because Peter came and hung out here. And so they perceive themselves to be the first among equals. But even as the other centers of Christianity began to drift apart in their own direction, in the Latin-speaking church, in the Roman church, the Bishop of Rome was recognized as the first among equals, that eventually developed into the papacy. As this, when I say the modern papacy, I'm talking I should just say the historical papacy of the Roman Catholic Church, in terms of that the Pope, who is the Bishop of Rome, is seen as the authoritative head of the Roman Catholic Church. And but in those other centers, the bishop of that of that particular diocese became known as the patriarch of their respective area, and somewhat that is somewhat linguistically different. Like, for example, the Pope of Alexandria is effectively the patriarch of the church in Alexandria, for example, even though that title is used. But generally, when we think Pope, it's Roman Catholic. And of course, as the different linguistic groups began to develop, especially in Eastern traditions, there were there was a Ukrainian patriarch, a Russian patriarch, a Greek patriarch, Syrian Orthodox patriarch, for example, that developed out of that. But because the Protestant Reformation happened within in the context of the Roman Catholic Church, this is where our starting point and our understanding of the Episcopal system, and oddly enough, why we don't use it. Because when the Reformation came around, the system of governance that was in place was the Roman Catholic Episcopal system based around the papacy and Rome. And when it came time, when the Reformation happened, each of the different movements within the Reformation began to try to figure out, okay, we have this governance system, what do we do with it? As they went through. And they had the options of retain it, but effectively sever relationships with Rome, but still maintain an Episcopal system. Reform it, in other words, change it up, or just reject it altogether. And each of the different movements within it, this is a gross oversimplification, but the ones that retained it would be the Lutherans and the Anglicans, and sort of, by extension, the Methodists, although really the Methodists themselves are kind of in their own category. So I'm going to deal with them later because they didn't come till later. Then there was the Reformers, anything Reformed Church, the Presbyterians, the Church of Scotland. They sought to completely reform it. They didn't reject it, but they reformed it. They still understood there was a hierarchy in terms of how to organize oneself, but they would reform it. And of course, not Presbyterian and Reformed, and any of the churches that understand themselves as being Reformed or Presbyterian, they sought to change it, but still there still needed to be a hierarchy of governance and of authority. And then you have the ones that just simply outright rejected it, and that was the various Anabaptist movements, especially the Amish, the Hutterites, and those movements that just simply rejected it altogether. And sort of out of that, various other things, like, for example, Quakers would be very much in this kind of rejection. And then as the Reformation continued to grow and splinter in different directions, you saw bits and pieces of this kind of interacting together and creating a whole bunch of multiple polities of how to be the church together, some successful and some not so successful. So what I wanted to do was just a side-by-side comparison. The column on the left there talks about the Episcopal system, which is a system we don't use, and yet it has parallels to what we do use. Is that generally there's kind of almost like a four-tiered level in almost any one of these polities, that you have the broadest, the highest authority. And in the case of, like, now the examples that I'm using here, this is specifically how the Anglican Church of Canada organizes itself. There is the General Synod, there are what are called ecclesiastical provinces, and those ecclesiastical provinces there's four in Canada. And then there's the diocese, and that little star there I'll get to in a moment, because I've got that star in every one of these, and it's an important one to pay attention to. And then there is the local parish. Now, generally we use the word parish and congregation to mean the same thing, but they're not necessarily the same thing. A parish is a geographic region in which there is usually only one church of that particular denomination, and everybody inside that geographic location is expected to attend that parish. That is their parish. That's what a parish is. Whereas a congregation is an association by choice. And even though, strictly speaking, Anglicans and Lutherans still operate on a parish model, these days they behave a lot more like congregations in terms of someone will draw, even though technically they're in one parish, they will drive to the other one. Now, Richard, I don't know if your experience was kind of this way, but generally in the Roman Catholic Church, this is also the way that system works, is that it is a parish that you're expected to attend the church closest to you.
That is true.
Okay? And so that's and so you don't become a member of a parish; you are simply born into it.
Mhm.
So technically, on the books, because I was baptized in an Anglican church, I am technically Anglican, which means I should technically be attending the nearest Anglican church, which I think is the St. Philip's by the Sea in Lanceville, if I was being strictly speaking. But considering that I've lapped through several other denominations since then, it anyway. But that's how the idea is, that the closest church to you, that is your church, no matter what. Whereas in the systems that we use, it's more by choice. The Presbyterian and Reformed, you'll see there's a direct parallels here, and these are analogous to each other, even though the means of governance within them are different. So you have the General Assembly, which is the highest authority within the Presbyterian. In this case, I'm using the Presbyterian Church in Canada as the names here. You have the General Assembly, which is the highest form of government, that meets once a year. You have synods, which are more like they roughly cover the equivalent of a Canadian province. Um, and then below that you have presbytery. Now, here's the interesting thing: in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, the synod is almost like a fifth wheel, because the presbyteries themselves are the ones that send delegates to the General Assembly. You don't send delegates to synod and then synod sends them to General Assembly. They all directly go to the General Assembly. So the synod is more handling regional stuff. Um, and there were some of my colleagues, including some people that I quite well respected, that viewed the synod as kind of a fifth wheel. And then there's presbytery, and you see that little star there, and then of course congregations within that. And so you have a certain number of congregations within a presbytery, just in the same way you have a number of parishes within a diocese, but it's all regionally based. Now, flipping over to Methodist, you'll see a similar. There's also there's a four structure here. Now, this is based not on the American model. So, Gary, this is maybe you may want to have some questions or offer your observations. This is, from what I understand, that this was the British model. So, the earliest forms of Methodism as it developed. When Methodism sort of separated itself from the Anglican Church, they still retained a certain degree of there were certain elements of it, but they referred to themselves more as a connectional kind of church. And so the largest form of governance would be the conference. Then you had districts, and then circuits, and the local churches. And interestingly enough, what I haven't marked here, and you'll notice the stars in a different place here, that ministers were not assigned to local churches. They were assigned to circuits, of which they partnered with other churches to work in an area under which there were several other local churches. And some of you may have heard of something called the circuit rider, where you would have, and this is something that Sue, growing up in a Methodist church in the in Australia, experienced directly, that you had a one or two ministers serving a number of churches in a different area. in the Methodist Church, the idea is that the circuit is where the ministers are engaged, employed, and they are responsible for the churches in the region, in a more localized region, and then individual local churches. So you could actually have, say, 6 churches and 3 ministers, and they're all kind of serving that area. Or, if they're well funded enough, you could have six ministers, 6 churches, but they're working at the circuit level. And then the fourth form is the Congregationalist form, and the Congregationalist forms are fiercely independent. The idea is that they are the ones who organize themselves, govern themselves, and there's that little star again, and I'm going to get to that shortly. And any interaction that they have with a larger body is a voluntary association with other like-minded groups, but that do not have the same degree of authority. Ultimately, for them, for a Congregationalist church, the ultimate authority lies at the congregation level, not at any higher point. But they can choose to be part of that association. But if there's something in that association that they don't like, they can also choose to remove themselves from. And with a certain much more freedom. Baptists, for example, tend to be Congregationalists, and so you might have heard of a Baptist convention. That's a common way of organizing themselves. And so, like, for example, the Southern Baptist Convention is seen as a larger denomination, but in fact, it's a whole bunch of individual Congregationalist Baptist churches that come together to agree on politics. But I despite the fact that we are theologically extremely different, I have someone that I know I would consider a friend who is a pastor in a Southern Baptist congregation. And every year, the congregation decides whether or not they're going to keep him. Every single year. They have a vote in the congregation as to whether or not they're going to keep him. And in the United Church of Canada, the Congregationalist Union of Ontario and Quebec and the Association of Local Union Churches were Congregationalist associations that chose to join with the United Church of Canada. So anyway, Gary, sorry, I should have stopped at the Methodist to say, if I remember right, the United Methodists in the States does use bishops. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So and the bishops exist at least in the British Methodist system, at the district level.
The district level, yes.
Yeah. So they use the term district, but they were the bishop in a district.
Yes,
Okay.
I believe so. Yes.
All right.
In my case, Missouri was a district, and they had one bishop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I have a colleague of mine who serves in the United Methodist Church in Alabama, and for a little while, I don't know, I think he's retired since then, but a fairly well-known teacher of preaching by the name of Will Willimon was the bishop for her district. And actually, some of Will's writings has influenced my preaching. I consider him because he was one of the people that whose books I had to read when I was in seminary. So,
but just a word about circuits and the history is that the early church, they didn't have enough clergy to support all the local churches, so you'd have one get on horseback and drive to the next. And Charles Wesley, it is said, wrote most of his hymns that we sing today on horseback.
Yeah. Yeah, and which is entirely true. It's like you had to do something to kill the time between those long journeys.
Yeah, and you had the beat of the hooves of the horse, and he came up with thousands of hymns.
Yes, he did. and and many of them we sing today. I haven't picked the hymns for I haven't picked the hymns for Sunday, but um, there's probably at any given time at least a 25% chance that one of Charles Wesley's hymns um, gets picked. Um, uh, he's that influential. He also has a series. It's in Voices United, oh, I even have a copy of it here. I might even, if we have a little time, I'll read it to you later because it doesn't have anything to do with this. But he has instructions on singing, which are wonderful. And actually, in some respects, they were written very seriously, but they're actually hilarious. So they're both serious and they're actually they can be quite funny. But anyway, I'll save that for the end if we have time. Um, Now, the thing is, when the United Church of Canada came together, the challenge was how do you take and just going back to uh, the Presbyterian Reformed system, the Methodist system, and the Congregationalist system. How do you get all of that to work together? And they were trying to figure out how do you actually bring three functionally different ways of governing oneself, in terms of a hierarchy of courts with the Presbyterians, the concept of the concept of the circuits, but actually, the one thing that I forgot to mention before we go any further, what that star means on each of these is that is the level of governance where the authority to ordain ministers or clergy, that's where it lies. So a bishop has the authority to ordain a priest. Hence, that's why that authority lies at the diocese level. At a presbytery level, I was actually ordained in my home congregation of Varsity Acres Presbyterian Church in Calgary by the presbytery of Calgary MacLeod. So I didn't have to go to a conference or somewhere else to be ordained. I was ordained in my home congregation by the presbytery. Whereas in the Methodist system, and conversely, which is something that was pulled into the United Church, is that the authority to ordain happens at the conference level, or as we'll get into, at the regional level, not at the presbytery level. So generally, people were ordained like in the Presbyterian system. You're ordained. Okay, you've got to call. Let's schedule an ordination service, and we do it. And that can happen at any point. So the anniversary of my ordination is February 7th, for example. Whereas most of my colleagues now in the United Church, their ordination anniversaries usually are somewhere around the end of May, beginning of June, because that's when those conferences happened, always. So you get a whole bunch of anniversaries happening here, and I'm kind of off in February by myself. Anyway, so some of the overlaps were pretty obvious, but some of it wasn't. So they eventually developed a means of retaining that four-tier hierarchy of church courts, or as they became known in the United Church as councils. And everybody agreed to that, but what they called them were a bit different. So they drew the names mostly from the Presbyterian and Methodist systems, and because the Congregationalists didn't really have names for that, they were kind of said, oh, whatever, we'll work with this. However, the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians insisted that they would have the right to call their own clergy under the supervision and accountability to the courts above them. In other words, like we want to retain the right to be able to call our own minister, because in the Methodist system they did not have that right, nor in an Episcopal system that clergy were assigned to them, and in the Methodist system clergy were assigned to a circuit, which they had very little say in, whereas Congregationalists and Presbyterians were very insistent on retaining that ability. So from 1925 until 2018, the courts, the council structure that we had at the top was, and frankly still is, the general council, and they would meet once every 3 years with a group that would like an executive that would sort of meet to deal with business along the way. Then conferences, which then retained the right to ordain, they met every year, and they represented a larger region. For example, I was welcomed into the United Church of Canada in what year was that? In 2015, I believe. Yeah, it was 2015. It was the year after my son was born. Even though I had been working for the United Church since 2012, my formal recognition as a United Church minister happened in 2015 at a meeting of conference. And in this case, it happened to be in Slave Lake, Alberta, but they would meet every year. And then presbyteries, on the other hand, represented a more local, a local area, usually of probably up to maybe a total of about 20 or so churches in a given geographic area, and they met between 4 and 12 times a year. Usually, the larger their area was, the less often they met. And whereas ones that were just centered around a city, they could meet every month. And then, of course, the individual congregations. But in 2018, for various different reasons, the United Church of Canada, for both economic and for mission reasons, looked at this because there was in terms of the different resources, you had presbyteries that were far flung way out and that didn't have a lot of access to resources, because the congregations in those presbyteries themselves did not have a lot of resources. And there was a trying to say, is there a better way we can do this? And ultimately what they came down to, for good or for ill, because there are some challenges with this, change the system to now be a 3-tier of council rather than a 4-tier. And what it meant was that they still had a general council that met once every 3 years, but it sort of perpetually meets as well. So there is an ongoing governance that happens there, and I'll get to that in a second. And then you have regions, and notice I kind of got that star there, and there's sort of a double star that I want to put onto this. And the regions meet once a year, usually in June, usually around the same time that conferences would meet. So conferences effectively became regions. But then what happened was presbyteries as a whole, like individual presbyteries, were effectively eliminated. So then you had, instead of congregations, they referred to them as communities of faith. Now, most communities of faith are congregations, but not all of them are. And I'll get to that in a moment. And the reality is that because of these changes, chances are most of us have, like, even if we were aware of how it worked before, most of us have no idea how it works now. So Gary, you're actually in good company, because most of us are still trying to figure this out. And oddly enough, as I was being received into the United Church of Canada, this was the polity that I was being received into. So I was being trained into it, even though in 2015, we knew that in 3 years, this is what it was going to look like, because it didn't just happen like that. There was long negotiations, planning, and everything else. But we also may not necessarily know how because of this reduction down to 3, especially communities of faith does describe congregations, but it also describes pastoral charges. So you might have like what used to be referred to as a 2-point charge. that you'd have one minister serving 2 or 3 or even 4 congregations in a given geographic area, which is reminiscent of the circuit ride. But the communities of faith also include camps, campus ministries, or even new types of ministry, whether it's new church development or something like, I don't know, how many of you have heard of Weird Church?
No.
Okay. Weird Church was is something that has developed in Cumberland, just north of us. And there's a few others that do this. That is church, but not in the way you expect. They don't meet Sunday mornings, for example. And what happened is that the United Church in Cumberland closed because the congregation couldn't sustain itself anymore, and they handed over ownership of the building. Because the other thing is, in the United Church of Canada, all property belongs to the national church. No local congregation owns their own building, period, across the board. Even though there's a congregational attendance, like I've been in circumstances that a number of different churches have thought, well, we're the exception, and then it's kind of like, well, no, that's not actually the case. If they are actually actively part of the United Church of Canada, the building is owned by the national church, and the local community of faith holds it in trust for them. But anyway, in the case of Weird Church, what happened is that Cumberland United Church ended up finding themselves not being able to sustain themselves, and they closed. Just the congregation closed. But there were enough United Church people still in Cumberland that says, yeah, but we'd still like to meet and have coffee and come together. And so they started meeting, oddly enough, in a pub. And then then just doing kind of general study. And then over time, they eventually began to they contracted quarter time with a minister who was also serving at another church in Comox, to say, can we borrow her for some of the time? And they started doing different types of programs and doing things that weren't usual church stuff. And the model they used was something called Weird Church, and I actually happen to have a book describing it. And the idea is it's about building church community and doing points of faith without actually necessarily doing the usual Sunday morning rituals. But over time, as Weird Church has continued, they've actually become again a viable congregation in Cumberland, to the point where they're now actually renting the building that they gave up, but not on Sunday mornings. And so those types of innovations in ministry. I mean, what we are currently looking at, for example, with the big screens and everything you set up for Rural Connect, that's another way of possibly handling that. But anyway, that's a discussion more for next week. But the idea is that a community of faith is not necessarily a congregation, but a congregation is a community of faith. Now, if you really want to bore yourself, or if you genuinely learn, there is the manual, which I can give you a link to, that actually details how all this works. But I mean, it's more along the lines, it's the nuts and bolts of how the polity works and what the responsibilities and roles necessarily are. Not something that people are required to read, but it is there. It is freely accessible. It's not hiding behind some sort of esoteric thing, but it's how we govern ourselves. But within the United Church, these communities of faith are considered to be the base unit, but they're not the source of authority. The source of authority lies at the General Council, but the base units are where the on-the-ground ministry often happens, and they can consist of more than one congregation, and they usually govern themselves through a board or a council that sets policy. In Trinity's case, we use a council model, for example, whereas the church that I served in Calgary used a board model. Now, do I really know what the differences are? Sometimes it's semantic. Some of them use but the idea is that these governing bodies are the primary decision makers. They're the ones who make the day-to-day decisions. And in some cases, if they need regional approval, they do it in partnership with the region. There are certain things that they are required, that the governing body still has the authority to do, but they still require consultation with the congregation. And that's sort of the underlying element of the congregationalist element of the United Church comes through at that point. So here's an example of some of those models. The session stewards official board model are a number of different things that is more representative of those coming from a Presbyterian system. There is a unified church board, which is what I worked with at St. Matthew's in Calgary, or what we have here, a church council. Curiously enough, here in Nanaimo, we have 4 different United Churches and 4 different governance models. We use a council model. St. Andrews has more of a session stewards official board. Brechin is more a unified church board, if I remember correctly. And whereas Cedar, on the other hand, the congregation itself is the governing body because they are so small. And so when they need to have the equivalent of a council meeting, they have a congregational meeting and usually have a lunch because they are that small. And when I was serving as the pastoral charge supervisor, I had to oversee a few of those meetings. Because one thing is, with any of these governing bodies, they can't officially meet without a representative from the region, and that's me, or that is the clergy that is serving in that area, or someone appointed to work with that. So, for example, our council can't meet officially without me being present, or me asking someone to be present on my behalf, and that's the same for any church. It's a little bit better than what I like. When I was serving the Presbyterian Church in Canada, I was the chair of every meeting that, like, by definition of my office, I had to be the chair. That was actually a function of my office. So it has been quite nice that for the past coming on 12 years, I haven't had to do that. That I've been able to participate rather than run the meeting. Now, again, as I said, certain decisions do need to be made from the point of view of like budgets, major financial expansions, renovations, and the election of board and council members, and changes to ministry personnel do require congregational approval. But that does not mean that the congregation is the ultimate authority, but that the governing body does require, through polity, for these elements, do require congregational approval to do that. And it provides an additional line of accountability. And speaking of accountability, members within a community of faith are accountable to the governing body of that community of faith. The governing body themselves are then accountable to the region that they are part of. So all of you as members, who are members of Trinity United Church, are accountable to our council, for what you do in relation to the church. But then conversely, the council is accountable to the region for what they do. On the other hand, as ministry personnel, I am accountable to the Office of Vocation, which is effectively at the general council level. And that's particularly in the shifts and changes that have happened. That's one of the big things, is that the creation of an Office of Vocation that's where the accountability line, because normally, like prior to that, the accountability would have been to the presbytery or the conference, at least for clergy.
So
Um,
explain again who the Office of Vocation is?
The Office of Vocation is a part of the General Council of the United Church of Canada, and the Office of so the General Council of the United Church of Canada maintains the Office of Vocation, and there are several people within that for whom, and they are responsible for people who are seeking to be ordained or commissioned have to work with the Office of Vocation for their education, but also their ongoing accountability. Like, for example, just recently I had to renew. There's some accreditation that I have to maintain. So, for example, one of them is boundaries. Like I had to attend and prove that I attended a boundaries workshop. That and that's something that I have to do, I think, every 3 to 5 years. I also have to maintain a police records check that goes to the Office of that has to be registered with the Office of Vocation. All of that accountability lies with that. And so if, for example, complaints about a minister come to a congregation, they are automatically kicked up to the Office of Vocation. The Office of Vocation looks at that. So if there's any discipline to be had, that's where it comes from. So so that's where that accountability is in terms of.
So then the pastor is not accountable, like you in Trinity, you are not accountable to your local church council.
No, like
Right.
officially, put it this way, officially no, but it's a really good idea that I'm on good relations with the local church council.
Right.
Put it that way.
And are you always part of the council's decision making? Do you have input
Yes.
at all those meetings? Yeah.
Yes, I'm present. Put it this way, they can't meet and make decisions without me being present as a representative from the region, because I represent that line of accountability. I am apparently allowed to vote. I normally don't, because of what I sort of learned about my own because it's still because ordinarily I don't. Ordinarily I don't vote, even though I'm present, but I fully participate in the meetings. I converse, but my task is to help, not to necessarily sway things in one direction or the other, but to try and help make sure that everything is being done, to borrow a Presbyterian term, decently and in good order. So that's how that works. So, kind of going back to that accountability line. Yes, my accountability is officially with the Office of Church Vocations, but it's a really good idea to maintain a good relationship with the congregation. And oddly enough, that in that sense, I am accountable to the Office of Church and Vocations for my conduct at the congregational level. And if I betray that trust with the congregation, then I'm betraying my accountability to the region or to the Office of Vocation. I don't know if that necessarily helps or not, Betty, but that's it's an important responsibility and distinction. But the thing is, the only body that has the authority to remove my ordination is the Office of Church Vocations. Put it that way. But there can be, but there are means by which congregations can appeal to the Office of Church Vocations, and I've seen that I've seen that played out. In my previous tribe, I was actually involved in one of these accountability things where I ended up being the prosecutor in a church trial that ended up with the first excommunication of a minister of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Now, as the prosecutor, I did not, I had not, this individual needed to be removed from ministry, yes. But what ended up happening is that, unsurprisingly, this particular individual appealed this to the General Assembly. The General Assembly went through, looked at everything they had, and he said, you know what, they were too lenient, and the General Assembly excommunicated the guy. There's my little bit of claim to fame that I was actually involved in one of the few excommunications in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. So anyway, that was not a pleasant experience, but it was one that I was involved in.
How many offices of vocation are there? Are there one per province, one per country?
In the United Church of Canada, there is one office of vocation, but then there are regional ministers. There are ministers assigned within each region, and they often work with the region. Like, for example, for Pacific Mountain and Chinook Winds, they share an office of vocation minister, and her name is Brenda Fox.
Oh, I get it.
Yeah, and so she oversees, and keep in mind, like yes, there's a disciplinary aspect to it. So you know, I am accountable to my conduct to Brenda, and Brenda happens to be she was a couple years behind me at VST, and put it this way, I do not ever want to be on her bad list. You know, so there is a certain degree of accountability there in that sense. But anyway, but that shows the distinction that the ministers, because we are ordained, like, for example, as a minister, I am not a member of Trinity United Church. I am a member of the Pacific Mountain region. That's where my membership lies. And it's just how how the how that kind of developed. I mean, unfortunately, that's a fairly deep rabbit hole that we may not necessarily have the time to get into. But my membership lies at the regional level, not at the congregational level.
But the pastors are called by the local community of faith.
That is correct.
You're called, and then can they uncall you, or
yes.
You know?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, a local congregation can choose to you know, if circumstances change or things, a council does have the ability to do what is called a request of change of pastoral relations. And so yes, they can do that, but usually there needs to be a fairly good reason to do that, and it has to be done in conjunction and consultation with region. But the short answer is yes. Like, for example, if a church gets to the point where they can no longer afford to pay a minister and meet their obligations for paying that minister, by default they have to request a change in pastoral relations, because, you know, if they are running out of money and their bank their loans are going to you know, that the bank account is going to default, it is their their responsibility to do so. And that's happened a few times. It happened in Campbell River. It's and a few other places where that has happened, and it is something to be mindful of. So that's one example. On the other hand, like a request and a change of pastoral relations can something, but that can come from the congregation. I mean, the process it can be a bit involved, but yes, it does happen.
And what is a charge? I think it was mentioned on one of your slides, but I didn't quite catch
Oh, okay.
what is a charge?
What we refer to as a pastoral charge is the same as it's a faith community or a community of faith.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, and the pastoral charge is the older form of talking about it. So without thinking about it, I brought that forward. And one of the reasons why it's sometimes referred to as a pastoral charge is because if you have two congregations, for example, in a what's called a 2-point in a shared ministry where they're sharing, like two congregations are sharing one minister, they are referred to as a 2-point charge. So broadly speaking, they applied the term pastoral charge, and pastoral charge means can mean one church. It can mean up to 4 in some cases. So the what I wanted to do is that one of the reasons why this process happened is they wanted to try and solve the inequality between rich and poor presbyteries, and by moving to regions, they could pool resources and work with that a little bit better. The difficulty is that there's no longer a regional requirement for clergy and lay people to get together, and there has been a missing of that. And so one of the reasons why on November 5th, when we got together in terms of that shared worship service, and it was overwhelmingly positive in terms of that feeling of we need to do this more often, is that sense of we are all part of the United Church of Canada in this area, and we're sharing ministry together. And there does seem to be a missing of that. And so, like, it was supposed to be solved through cluster groups. The idea is that different churches in an area should work together. And of course, this was the idea when this started in 2018 and then 2019, and then all of a sudden COVID hits. And we've been recovering from that ever since. And so the idea is that as local churches, we are supposed to try and work together more on an informal basis, not in any sort of formal way, because the formal decisions are at the regional, at the local community of faith and at the regional level. But the idea is that it is we're trying to do that more often. And I mean, fortunately, at least here in Nanaimo now, that 2 of the clergy are married to each other. I'm one half of that, and the other 2 we're friends with. And so the 4 of us are you're going to see us working more closely together, at least amongst the clergy. Like, for example, we are working with St. Andrews and with Messy Church. We hosted it back in September, and St. Andrews gets to host it a week from Friday. And so that's an example of local churches working together. And we're trying to do that more often. But truth is, COVID blew a big hole in that, and we're trying to recover from that. Now, just to give you an idea, the regions in the United Church, as they look now, is this map right here, and there are 16 regions in the United Church of Canada. Each of them have their own names that they came up with. We happen to be, and they represent 2,000 communities of faith. Apparently that it's roughly 2,600 congregations, but 2,000 discrete communities of faith in this area. Each region ranges, the largest of the region happens to be the one that we are in. Pacific Mountain region is the largest of the regions with 174 communities of faith as part of it. But we're only the largest by 2. And surprisingly enough, the next biggest one is not in Ontario. The next biggest one is Saskatchewan with 172. The smallest one, and this is not a surprise, is Nokanhaha, and that's Quebec, and that's representative of 76 communities of faith. Most of them are somewhere in the 120 to 150 communities of faith. Chinook Winds, which is southern Alberta, is 91, whereas Northern Spirit, I think, is about 120. And so you can see these different ones that they've done. I'm looking at this, and I'm realizing that particularly Prairie to Pine and Canadian Shield, actually one is basically Manitoba and part of Ontario, and the Canadian Shield is basically northern Ontario. And this work that we're doing with Rural Connect is connected with Thunder Bay. And I need to ask Randy which region he's actually part of, because it looks like Thunder Bay is right on the dividing line between the two. So that's a question that I have. Oh, I don't know if you noticed this. Nova Scotia, right here, is actually known as the region of Nova Scotia and Bermuda, because we have one united church in Bermuda. So
I know why. I bet it's for all those people that fly south in the winter.
Possibly, but I'm not sure if I think partly is because when oddly enough, the Presbyterian Church in Canada also has a congregation in Bermuda as well. There's one United Church, one United Church of Canada and one Presbyterian Church in Canada, but they happen to be both in Bermuda. And I think in part is because there's been a historical connection, at least initially, with those denominations and Canada as well. But it's interesting because it's the only case where we actually have our national denomination actually has a church that is actually a functioning community of faith outside of our national boundaries. So as I mentioned before, the General Council is the highest governing authority in the United Church of Canada. The spiritual leader is referred to as the moderator of the United Church of Canada. And that's a term that was actually brought in from the Presbyterians at Church Union, because the highest office of authority in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, that is an elected one-year term office in the Presbyterians, is also the moderator. Right now, that is the Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne. And curiously enough, she's from the Lower Mainland. And she is the first Indigenous moderator of the United Church of Canada. So the General Council is made up of 260 members, and those members are made up from the immediate past moderator. Okay, sorry, she's the first female Indigenous moderator. Sorry, my wife just corrected me. The immediate past moderator, who is the Reverend Richard Bott, right? Who's the most recent moderator. The General Secretary, the leaders of the 16 regional councils, and then 204 members elected by regional councils to attend this, as well as 15 members chosen by the National Indigenous Organization and the executive of the General Council. That's the makeup of the General Council. And the General Council meets in person once every 3 years, but those who are elected to that body meet at least once a year by other means. So all those 260 members continue to meet and handle business as they rise. So it's not just a case of they have one meeting and you got to wait 3 years to the next. They deal with business as it arises at the national level as on an ongoing basis. But there's also several permanent committees and special short-term units that deal with specific issues. Of that, I mentioned the Office of Vocations, for example, earlier. One of those is, and all ministry personnel who are ordained or commissioned are accountable to the Office of Vocations. On the other hand, sometimes there's licensed lay worship leaders or designated lay ministers. They are accountable to the congregation, whereas whether one is ordained or commissioned, they're accountable to the Office of Vocation. The Office of Vocation is also the one that's responsible for vetting candidates for ministry and eventually the bringing that out. So this is my blank slide, which means any open questions, because we're now just at the 8:30. We're at the 8:30 mark, which is about where I try to end. But any questions you have with this, if that helps in terms of how we govern ourselves, and where things where our governance system meets, because I mean it did start as an Episcopalian system, and this is what it's evolved into.
What is the distinction between ordination and what was the other one? Commission.
Well, yeah.
Like the gentleman at Cedar was commissioned and your wife was ordained.
Yes.
Well, is it a matter of training?
Mostly it is a matter of training. Those who are commissioned are commissioned as what are called as diaconal ministers. In other words, their training and focus is largely community engagement and like I am ordained to word, like as a Presbyterian, I was ordained to word and sacrament, but in the United Church, it's word, sacrament, and pastoral care. And in those who are commissioned, it's teaching, service, and pastoral care. So there is a little bit of an overlap. But the idea is that they have specialized training, often in things like community engagement, often the types of work that they take on tend to be more of a teaching element to it. But at the same time, when a given position is open, they are certainly eligible to apply. Most ministers, most diaconal ministers, are trained in Winnipeg through what is called the Center of Christian Studies, and they usually receive a certificate. A certificate, and the programs normally it's about 2 or 3 years, but I've got a colleague who's been working on his for about 8. Whereas someone who's ordained usually goes through the more traditional process of getting an undergraduate degree and then doing a Master's of Divinity at one of several colleges within the United Church of Canada. And trouble is because I was ordained Presbyterian, there were 3, and in the United Church of Canada, there's more than that. As a matter of fact, Sarah, are you nearby? She's not, but one of the overlapping seminaries is the Vancouver School of Theology, which is both Presbyterian and United Church, and that's what I went to. But there's also, I believe, there's one in Edmonton, one in Saskatoon, there's one in Toronto, there's one in I believe at Queens, in Kingston, there's one in Montreal, and there's one in Halifax. but these are places where people are trained specifically for word and sacraments. So, like me, they work towards a master's of divinity, and upon reception of that, and if they're properly vetted through the Office of Church Vocations, then they're cleared for ordination. Whereas diaconal ministers work through the Center of Christian Studies that's in Winnipeg. But I think like I believe VST offers some of that training that they can do, but largely it's managed through Winnipeg, and they are then, at the time that, say, someone like me would be ordained, they would be commissioned. So, for example, John Helps was commissioned to teaching service and pastoral care at the last regional gathering, which happened to be in Abbotsford, just across in the Lower Mainland, and I was there for that service.
Does he have the authority then, or to run to have the communion and to baptize?
Yes, he does. And that's a designation that's been a little bit more recent. It's been part of the dialogue, but in his role specifically, yes, he does have the authority to both baptize and perform communion. Whereas, of course, prior to that, like, for example, he helped me serve, like he worked with us at Trinity for a while. Mostly, there wasn't anything formal, but he came and hung out with us because he actually works here, and he's only 14 hours a week in Cedar, and his week job, like during the week, he actually works for the Island Crisis Care Society, which is where he feels his calling. So that's, in terms of service, that's where he is actually that's where he is commissioned to, but he happens to do Cedar kind of as a side thing, if that makes sense. Okay. So, like, Cedar does not pay him full time. He is 14 hours a week. So, the rest of the time, he's actually not far from where his office is actually upstairs from the Nanaimo Bakery. Is where the Island Crisis Care Society maintains its offices right now. So, any other questions? Richard, did you have any, or are you good? I'm curious as to your take on it.
I'm actually okay. That was just a lot of information.
Yeah, it always is. I'm sorry.
And I thought the Catholic Church was complicated.
Truth is, they are. Like I just skipped over the top of the Roman Catholic Church. To get actually into organizations, like how monasteries work and all that kind of fun stuff.
Yeah. And then it's like, oh my.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
And it's kind of like, okay, how much time do we have? And it's like all you needed to know is the whole the idea of bishops parishes, and then that kind of development of that 4-tiered hierarchy, and that's what we inherited, and hopefully that's all we necessarily needed to know, and then just getting to that.
So in 1 minute or less, how does all of this governance work with the hub that we're thinking of when we're bringing in many regions?
Well, now specifically, the hub that we are working with here will only happen within Pacific Mountain. We're only within one region.
Okay.
Now, as it happens, we're kind of staying local to Vancouver Island right now, and on the short term, it is just a cooperation between pastoral charges, and that's all it will be. Whether it is to supply, mostly it's to provide effectively an opportunity to worship together on Sunday mornings, and nothing more than that, unless a congregation says, hey, we would like to engage with a little bit more with pastoral care. But sometimes that may not be possible. Like in the work that I've been doing in terms of learning how this is working in Ontario, it there's a wide spectrum of how it works. Like, for example, um, the one example that I brought up, I think earlier, is talking about how Southampton was providing worship services to a church in Kitchener, which is 3.5 hours away. All they were doing was providing Sunday morning. There was no pastoral care or any sort of link with that. And there were two churches further away, similar sort of thing. But just recently, they've actually done an agreement with a church in Collingwood, which is only about an hour and a half, maybe an hour away, where there is some sharing of pastoral care resources. So it does vary from group to group to group to group. In our case, because it's a pilot project, we're just trying to get ourselves and other churches just to try it out to see if it's viable.
Okay, so
Um,
it's like each one of the congregations still has their own council.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yes. I mean, there could be at a later point, but this is more of a discussion for next week
Yeah,
of
yeah.
us pulling back in the Methodist circuit model. But
Mhm.
currently, there's not really room for that within our polity, so we would have to get exemptions to do that. But right now, the idea is that each individual congregation is still cooperating and is on their own. And if they choose to work together, that then becomes an agreement between those congregations. That region would get involved in terms of making sure that everybody's being treated fairly. But for the most part, it is individual congregations cooperating. The difference is that this allows cooperation over a greater distance. And so, for example, some of the churches that I'm hoping to talk to, and uh, the beyond, like, we've been talking to Campbell River. Campbell River is sort of trying to make up their mind, but there are several other churches that are also interested, which include possibly Denman Island, Port McNeill, as well as James Bay down in Victoria. Are three that we're looking at as well. But our job right now is to get our stuff up and operating, just to see if this is going to work for us. The fortunate thing with it being a trial project is if we get to the end of it and we say this isn't going to work for us, the equipment just simply picks up and goes somewhere else.
Right.
So and the grant takes care of the rest, which I think that helps as well.
So sometimes you'll be the minister giving the sermon, and sometimes Campbell River, if they come on, well, their minister would give a sermon. And
Well, most of the time, the churches that would be joining us because they do not have a regular minister. So the idea is I would still be the one preaching most of the time.
Mhm.
I mean, we've kind of tossed around ideas about that. I could conceivably go up there and preach one Sunday, and you would see me on the screen. You would still see me, but I would be on the screen. We have not got to that point, and I mean, we might get to that point maybe 6 months after we actually start doing it for the first time.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure. I'm not sure at this point. But is the potential there? Absolutely. Is it going to happen like that? That's a conversation that we have to have with council and with region. So we're not going to make any decisions in that regard without talking to people first. So, but there's other possibilities that, like, for example, I've used Revelstoke as an example, because they're 100 kilometers from anybody else, and they can only afford part-time.
Did I hear you say they have to be within the same time zone?
Generally the same time zone, only because of when you're doing planning. Like, if a church, for example, we worship at 10:30, and that means if, say, a church in Ontario wants to team up with us, well, either we've got to move our worship services to really early in the morning, or they've got to move theirs to really late in the afternoon. So that's just a practicality thing. I mean,
I was just thinking about the other part of BC, like my son's in Kimberley, for example, but that's an hour before us.
oh, that's right, because they're on the other side of the time zone. So yeah, I mean, there would have to be like generally you want to stick within the same time zone, but for the most part within the region. I mean, yes, we could potentially do something with Kimberley, although I think they just got a new minister, if I remember right. But that would be like there would have to be some negotiation around worship times. And that's one of the reasons why the folks with Rural Connective have said you kind of want to stick to the same time zone.
Yeah.
But it's not required because we've had a chance to actually work with the equipment and connect to people like we can with our equipment connect with the people in Ontario, and we already have to do to do some
Yeah,
testing.
that's crazy.
And so we can connect to Halifax if we want to. Now, I'm not sure if Halifax has anything yet, but we can certainly connect with Saskatchewan with any of the ones already with what we have. But time zone just is one of the factors that comes in if you're dealing with Sunday morning worship. But
Okay, we've enjoyed it, John. We're gonna
yeah.
sign off now.
All right, thank you.
Good
So,
night.
good night.
Thank you,
Yes.
John. I
Yeah.
didn't
Thank
realize
you.
all that.
Oh, no worries, no worries for that. No, and I mean, I'm happy to stick around. I have to retrieve my son. My son is 2 doors up at a friend's place. I do have to retrieve him before he goes to bed. But if there's anything else in terms of that, I'm happy to answer any more questions, or we can pick this up next week when we start talking about where we're going, because part of what we were just talking about
Yeah.
is the where we're going.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Okay, thank you. I'll sign off too.
will do. I'm just going to hit the stop share and I'll stop the recording.